might find new life.
Hello, am I here? Hi, friends. Good afternoon. Welcome to our story sharing afternoon. It's so good to see you all here. I hope that you leave today feeling inspired and enlightened and a little bit internally conflicted, because that's how things are in this complicated world. I'm Erin. I'm one of the 20-ish people that went on the Israel-Palestine Jan term. And I will be kind of our MC for today, and then you'll get to hear from several other people on the trip, and then we'll have some space for Q&A at the end. So if you think of anything, write it down in your mind or on your phone if you are a forgetful person, because we'll have time for questions and answers. Also, if you are someone who has no idea what is going on and you're like, I'm just here because I know someone on the trip, I don't even know what Israel-Palestine is, not to worry. Well, there will be information. You will not feel like you're just swimming in unknown names and dates. We will give you a little video. Another disclaimer, if you are on the other side of the spectrum and you're very well acquainted with the conflict, our perspective is deeply influenced by our experiences that we had while we were in Israel and Palestine. And to be completely honest, we didn't interact very much with Jewish Israelis. We interacted with them in stores where we might have bought things from them. We interacted with a settler or two. If you don't know what that is, you'll find out soon. But for the most part, our one-on-one, close, friendly interactions were with Palestinians. And so my disclaimer is that if you feel like we are heavy on the Palestinian perspective, it is not because we hate Israel or any of those things. It's because the biggest influence that we've had in our time there were our Palestinian friends and hosts that we met. So I just thought that was important to disclaim if you are noticing something that feels like bias. It's not intentional. It's just our experience, and that's all we can share. Now, before we get into stories, I'll just talk a little bit about where we went. If you've been to Israel or Palestine, you'll be like, these are familiar. And if you haven't, maybe you'll see these pictures and decide to go for yourself. So we did 3 weeks there. We started in Galilee, which is in the northern part of Israel. Galilee is where Jesus did most of his ministry. He's from Nazareth, which is a village in the north of Israel near Galilee. We started and stayed in a hotel in a place called Tiberias, which was also a pretty big city back in biblical days, but is really big now. That's the Sea of Galilee right there. On the far left is the view from our hotel, which was beautiful. That's a picture of us in a synagogue in Capernaum. So we also went to Capernaum, which if you've read the Bible, you've read a lot about. Jesus did a lot of healings and miracles there. And Peter's mother-in-law lived in Capernaum, and that actually became one of the early churches after Jesus' death and resurrection, centered in Capernaum. So that's us in the synagogue there that's still standing. Oh, clicker. We'll never know. So sad. Technical difficulties. I got it. Also in Galilee, we went to Nazareth, where Jesus was born and grew up. On the left, you'll see a picture of Mary. There's a church there called the Church of the Annunciation, which celebrates the angel coming to Mary and telling her she's going to be the Virgin Mary. And that picture on the left was actually a really special moment from the trip. We got to go and see the ancient ruins that were buried below a convent, like a current day convent, that are theoretically, possibly, seems like it could be likely, maybe, the house of Joseph, the father of Jesus. That's what you'll find out when you go to Israel-Palestine, is that everything is theoretically, probably, maybe, likely the place, because everything happened 2,000 years ago, so there's no way of knowing. But it was pretty likely, and we got to tour it with this other group. You might see some unfamiliar non-Whitworth people here. It's because this was another group that we met up with from New Zealand, and while we all waited to go look at the house, we sang some songs together, and it was a really sweet moment of kind of cross-cultural witness that was really sweet. We moved from Galilee to, oh no, not the clicker. Then we went hiking for 4 days in the West Bank, or we tried to hike for 4 days. There were some complications. We started in Arba. As you can see, if you've ever been to the Bay Area, West Bank looks a lot like Central California, where I'm from. We hiked through the hills for the first day, 6 miles, through these little villages, sheep herders, random people from the village, so confused why there was 20 Americans there and so excited and interested about our presence. The second day, we hiked up to Sebastia, which was like a 10 to 12 mile hike, so that was a longer one. This is the view from our guest house in Sebastia. It was really beautiful. We, for various reasons, got kind of deterred from our third day of hiking and didn't end up getting to hike the third day, so we just hung out in Sebastia, which was great. That left picture is Nidal, our guide, cooking lunch for us as we were hiking, which was just really fun, cooking on like outdoor fires and making this amazing Palestinian tomato soup. Then we ended up in Jericho, which is at the very south. And if the word West Bank, the phrase West Bank is confusing to you, just hold it in your brain. You'll find out in a second what it means. But just know it's Palestine. We went to Jericho, saw a monastery in the rock, hiked through this wadi, which is a river valley. And then this is also in the West Bank. We actually saw this later. But this is the wall in Bethlehem. So the West Bank and Israel are separated by a wall. Some places that wall is an actual wall, like in Bethlehem, because Bethlehem and Jerusalem are like Spokane and Spokane Valley, not exactly size-wise, but in terms of closeness. So imagine if there was a wall between here and Spokane Valley. That's in Bethlehem, and they've put all sorts of, on the Palestinian side, Palestinians have painted all sorts of art and put up stories as a form of protest for the wall. But some places the wall is just a fence, like especially in northern Palestine, but there's a border wall all the way through. Then we went into Jerusalem. We left the West Bank, went back into Israel. This is some pictures from us in the old city, which was fun. And then we went back into the West Bank for our last 4 days in Bethlehem, which is where you'll hear most of our stories from, because we got to stay with amazing Palestinian Christians who hosted us in their homes and fed us amazing food that tastes like what you're eating now, and let us stay in their rooms, and all of these just wonderful, wonderful, hospitable acts that we got to experience. Here are some pictures from one of the homestays, and we also got to visit the Dead Sea, which is the most disconcerting experience you will ever experience. Your legs float. It's so strange. And then on the left is some pictures from a Palestinian refugee camp that we got to visit. The refugee camps in Palestine have been there so long. The major refugee crisis in Palestine began in 1948 and have been there so long that they've gone from tent cities to being actual cities with like buildings and stuff like that. But obviously they're still refugee camps and still run by the UN in a lot of places, and so under-resourced cities. And let me change to the next slide. And now I'm going to pass it off to Savannah, who's going to share with us about the Holy Sepulchre.
Marhaba, which is hello in Arabic. Also, if you want to know, delicious is zaki. So what you're eating is very zaki. So by show of hands, who here actually knows what the Holy Sepulchre is? Okay, so like 30% of you? That is okay, because I totally did not know what the sepulchre was either. And let's see if this will click. Maybe not. I'm a communications major, so. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus' tomb is supposedly. And you know that something is holy because it has a church built on top of it most times. And if not one church, multiple churches. But I think that this had a temple to Athena and then the church. So this is in the middle of the old city and is a very touristy spot. So we first went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the daytime and kind of got to look around, but it was so crowded that we decided we would go the next morning at 5 a.m. And if you know me, you know I'm not a morning person, so I was not set up for success in this. Thank you for requiring that, Haley. But before we went, we kind of got to learn a bit about the dynamics of this church. And the church is owned by multiple different congregations of Christianity because it's this holy site. Everybody wants a piece of it. And so there is something called the status quo. So there's the way the church is set up is that there's kind of the center area, which has the sepulcher, which is the tomb. And that's the big box building thing in the center picture there. So that's the center that all these other mini churches are put around. And so the status quo was basically put in place to keep everybody at peace with one another. So they can't move anything. They can't try to take any control. And the best representation of this is if you see on this balcony right here, this little tiny ladder. Before the status quo was put in place, a worker was up there doing, some renovation or another, left their ladder up there, status quo was put in place. If you move the ladder, then that means you own the whole church. So nobody has moved that ladder for hundreds, I don't know how long, really, really, really long time. And it's just a representation of the division that is amongst arguably one of, if not the holiest site. And so there has been fist fights in front of the church, brawls, all sorts of things. So we went in the morning to avoid the crowds and not have to wait in line to go to the church. 5 a.m., not a great time for me. Went in, and it's peaceful. There's a couple other people in there. And we're like, okay, we're going to have our Jesus time. We're going to have our Jesus moment. And so my good friend Marnie and I were like, well, you know what? We want to be the first into the tomb. Like, we want to have our time with Jesus in the tomb. So we sat outside of this little building and waited as a priest had gone in and done the blessing or whatever. Later found out that they were actually holding Mass for the Catholic people. And so I'm reading about Jesus in the Bible and setting myself up to prepare. And probably about an hour into waiting, this big tour group comes in. So it's about 6 a.m. at this point. This huge tour group comes in, and I start to feel this defensiveness in me of oh my gosh, Marnie and I have been waiting here for an hour. We better be the first to get into this tomb. We deserve this moment. Just started to feel really, really icky. And I literally sat down and started journaling, and I'm like, God, this is your holiest place, and I feel so icky right now. Why am I being so defensive at your holiest place? And so probably the third Mass service gets out, and we tried to sneak in, but we see that the 50-plus people are about to have their own Mass service. And so we try to run into the actual part. So there's a room in the sepulcher, and then a smaller room within that sepulcher, or within there, that's just a marble slab. And that's supposed to be Jesus' tomb. Really, it would have been really deep in the ground. And so we kind of rush in there and try to get our moment to suddenly be met by one of the priests snapping and clapping at us to get out and yelling at us. And so then I proceed to have an emotional breakdown, which is probably my lowest point of the trip, where I'm so upset and I'm just ready to go. This is so dumb. I'm totally playing. I realize that I'm playing into all of the grossness of this church, of the physical part of the church. But I just am so emotional, and it's 6 a.m., so I just can't control my anger. And so we're let's go. And I didn't even get to see the church. Okay, we'll go look around. Walking away, I see Forrest. He's like, oh, you should go upstairs. You can go kneel at the cross. There's so many people that have kneeled at the cross that the stone has grooves of people's knee marks in there. I'm like, okay, whatever. Go upstairs. Huge line. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And so I go back downstairs, and I see Haley, and I'm crying. And I'm like, Haley, I don't know what Jesus would want, and I don't think I can say what Jesus would want, but he would not want this. And I'm just so upset. And so we leave, there's about 4 of us, and we go back to our place we were staying, if you want to click to the next slide. And we decide to watch the sunrise, and it's totally quiet outside. This is a picture of it, and it's completely peaceful. And I just have this realization, I'm kind of getting over the icky, angry feelings that I've had And I just realized that, like, God's church is just the nature that he's made around us, and that I don't need to go to some church, which I honestly think is really ugly, to feel the presence of God and feel the presence of Jesus. And so this is just like continue to be reaffirmed for me throughout the day. We go to what's called the Garden Tomb, which is those photos on the right, which isn't really as historically or geographically accurate of likely where the tomb was, but is a good visual representation. And we have this really, really sweet communion service together where we're singing and giving communion to one another. That was just a really healing moment for me. And so I learned a couple things from that day. A, you don't need to be in the Holy Land or be in a specific spot to experience God. And number two is that God can redeem the day, because if you go to the next slide, then Haley and I ended up getting tattoos at the oldest tattoo shop in the world, which do not tell the travel nurse that, because we weren't supposed to do that. So yeah, that was probably one of the hardest days that I experienced, but I learned some important lessons. And to quote Nolan at Circle Time, my God is not in that box. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Savannah. That was great. We have a few songs that we are going to ask you guys to sing with us if you feel led. These are sort of the soundtrack from our trip. Alexis was so sweet to lead us in worship while we were there. And these are songs that resonated with the things that we were thinking and feeling while we were there. I also got a tattoo at the oldest tattoo shop in Israel.
So cute. I think there's like 6 total.
Yeah, 6. Feel free to stand or sit.
Yeah, you may worship with us or listen.
Our mouths, they were filled with laughter. Our tongues, they were loose with joy. Restore us, O Lord. Restore us, O Lord. And although we are weeping, Lord, help us keep sowing the seeds of your kingdom, for the day you will reap them. Your sheaves we will carry. Lord, please do not tarry. All those who sow weeping go out with songs of joy. The nations will say, He has done great things. The nations will sing songs of joy. Restore us, O Lord. Restore us, O Lord. And although we are weeping, Lord, help us keep sowing the seeds of your kingdom, for the day you will reap them. Sheaves we will carry. Lord, please do not tarry. And all those who sow weeping go out with songs of joy. Although we are weeping, Lord, help us keep sowing the seeds of your kingdom, for the day you will reap them. Your sheaves we will carry. Lord, please do not tarry. All those who sow weeping go out with songs of joy. All those who sow weeping go out with songs of joy.
You can have a seat. Thanks. That's Alexis Yo on the guitar and the vocals, Cassidy Franklin on the vocals, and Nolan Carthan on the drums and foot tambourine. So true. Now, if you were like, I don't know what these words mean, West Bank, Palestine, Israel, I hope you've heard of them at least, but you would like to know more, not to worry. We have a video telling you what the heck is going on in Israel-Palestine, so please enjoy. Also, I made some
One of
cuts
the
to this
biggest
video,
myths about
so
the Israel-Palestine conflict is
if
that
it's
it's been
choppy,
going on
that's
for
why.
centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because the housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank. The settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent, Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the First Intifada. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. This violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years, and a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right, the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, and that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, often respond with protests and sometimes with violence, though most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace. No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses. But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
So, I made a couple of cuts to that video just for time's sake, but if you want to know the in-depth history, you can find that on the Vox YouTube channel. I'm now going to invite Nate Kerber up. There he is, to share. He was actually not on our trip, but he studied abroad in Jordan, which is right next to the West Bank and next to Israel, for the fall semester. So.
مرحبا أنا اسمي أتيا درست في عمان لأربع شهور. My name is Nate. I studied in Jordan for 4 months. We had the opportunity to study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for the first month of our stay in Jordan. And after that time, we spent 2 weeks in the West Bank and Israel. We had the opportunity to stay with both Palestinian Christians as well as Jewish settlers over the Green Line. So we had to journal a lot about our time there, and so I'm just going to share one of the stories that I wrote about our experience. Eli commands the room, standing at the pulpit of the synagogue in gray tactical pants and a tan polo. His automatic rifle is slung casually over one shoulder, and he speaks with a slightly English accent in the casual tone of an off-duty soldier. He made Aliyah, or his immigration to Israel through birthright, when he was 20. Throughout our discussion, he fidgets with the rifle. sliding the strap back and forth over his shoulder like a child's school bag. After a long military career, he was offered the position as the head of security and the leader of the all-volunteer emergency response force a few years back, and has been serving the community ever since. We ask him about security threats to Efrat, the settlement where we've been staying for the last few days, and he launches into stories of close calls. Last year, he was in the middle of bathing his young son when his phone started blowing up. Suspected Palestinian terrorists had entered an agricultural field within Efrat's municipal borders. Eli's wife was out shopping with their other children, and the neighbors were out of town. Seeing no alternative, he suited up in his Kevlar vest, dried his son off, grabbed his rifle, and tossed both in the backseat of his car. They were out the door before the bath had finished draining. After an underground tour of Bethlehem's holy sites and the less than sacred recent histories of these sanctuaries turned battlegrounds, I asked Rima, my Palestinian host mother, about her memories of the Second Intifada, particularly the month-long siege of the Church of the Nativity, in which 8 Palestinians were killed and the church was essentially demolished. She doesn't want to talk about that. She does, however, tell us about 40 days of 24-hour curfew imposed on their sleepy neighborhood of Beit Zahor, just south of Bethlehem. They were allowed out for a couple hours every day to buy essentials, but other than that, they were confined to their homes as soldiers patrolled the streets below. Their second daughter was only a few months old and couldn't see her grandparents down the block or even her aunt across the street. Eli sped off toward the field, and again, seeing no alternative, he couldn't leave his son alone in the car with terrorists on the prowl, tucked the boy inside his bulletproof vest and got out of the car. He was terrified. Fortunately, backup arrived a few minutes later before he'd even apprehended the subject, and he and another emergency response crew member were able to apprehend them without too much fanfare. Yeah, Eli says, with the casual nonchalance of a veteran who's seen much worse, that one could have gone really bad. Rima's husband, Raja, had been unable to travel to Jerusalem for his construction job, and all projects in Bethlehem were suspended during the lockdown. After a week of absence, the school Rima was teaching at, outside the city limits and thus still in session, told her to come in to teach the next day or to not come back at all. And so, during the lockdown of Beit Zahor, she and the other teachers from the neighborhood left their kids behind and slept at the school during the week, racing home on the weekends to make it back before the non-curfew window closed. And so it went, until the Israelis eventually decided to lift the 24-hour curfew, and life regained some semblance of normalcy. And then the wall went up, and everything changed. It was difficult to hear either of those stories on their own. Taken together, they are profoundly confusing. If these two people were to pass on the street, which would be extremely unlikely, despite the fact that they live less than 30 minutes away from each other, they'd give each other as wide of a berth as possible. And if they managed to avoid a direct confrontation, they would never know this unique trauma bond that they share. How can both of these narratives be true? That dichotomy is where I sat for most of my time in the so-called Holy Land.
I'm going to pray for us. Jesus, we come before you. Thank you for this opportunity to share our experiences, Lord. Thank you for every eternal being here in this space. Would we draw near to you now? Would the words that we sing glorify you, and Lord, would we just sing songs that are from the depths of our hearts, and would they sink in. Lord, thank you for being with us. Amen. It says he is among us. Moving up in the world, okay. You'll find me with the broken and the weak in the spaces in between. You'll hear my voice cry out with those who weep, only if you're listening. Whatever you do for the least of these, you do. You'll find me with the ones without a voice, the forgotten and ignored. My blessing is on those who love the poor. Do you open up the door? Whatever you do for the least of these, you do it unto me. Whatever you do for the least of these, you do it unto me. Hallelujah, hallelujah. He is among us. He is among us. Hallelujah. Hallelujah, He is among us. He is among us. Hallelujah, hallelujah, He is among us. He is among us. By this the world will know the Father's love. We will know the Father's love.
Thanks, Alexis. Now Marnie's going to share with us about her Palestinian homestay and friends.
Hello, everyone. I'm so thankful that you all are here today. It's a great turnout. I'm so glad you can come join us and get to hear a bit about our experience. Because a month is a pretty long time, even though it went by so fast. One of the most meaningful and impactful parts of the trip were just the relationships we got to build with the various people we met, particularly the Palestinian people.
Our tour guides and our homestays were Palestinian Christians, and we spent a lot of our time with them. If you know me, I get really motion sick while traveling, and so I sat in the front on every bus and every van and had the opportunity to talk with our tour guides more one-on-one and extensively. Getting to hear the stories of our tour guides and our host families were just such a gift. It was so beautiful to see just how evident their faith and their joy and their peace and their sorrow was. It was all just a whole mix of things that I just getting to be a part of that experience, to hear their stories, I feel like is something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about that. Because we spent a lot of our time traveling together. We spent a lot of time at historical sites, hiking, in worship, having meals together around the table, and in general, just in fellowship with one another. So it was only natural that we would listen and share together. I mentioned the sorrow, but it was true that a lot of the stories that we heard, or at least that I heard, were heavy. It's not hard to live under occupation, especially as a Palestinian Christian. I remember our first tour guide, once he felt that we were safe to share with, he shared how he was just really heartbroken that he couldn't bring his mother back to her homeland, that she was forced to leave as a child to this day. And it really weighed on me thinking about how someone could be so apart from just like that sense of belonging for such a long time, and kind of also have no hope of returning, at least with the present state of the conflict. Our hiking tour guide shared about his frustrations with his own government, the Palestinian Authority. He shared that a lot of people in his community don't feel safe around their police, and that they cannot trust that when they call for help that they will be there and that they will be on their side. And this is due to various issues, but lots of it run deeply and systemically. Staying with our host family was just, I stayed with another student, Lisa, with our host family, and it was obvious that it took a while for them to warm up to us, not in the sense of, welcoming us into their homes and sharing their food and sharing their day-to-day life with us. Like, that was no issue, but asking about what it's like living where they are, what relationships that they have not been able to maintain as well as they could just because of the restrictions on travel, like with their family, and even just the difficulty in, I don't know, I could sense that, especially our host mom, she was like very defensive explaining to us what was happening in Bethlehem, and it broke my heart that she felt the need to be that defensive, because we studied in our prep class what is happening with the political occupation and the political unrest, so we could understand that there's clear injustice happening here. But talking to her, she seemed to be really careful about the words she used around us to make sure that she wasn't offending us or America, and that she just felt the need to over-explain that this is the way things are, this is how the police works, this is why our infrastructure is so poor, all these things. And I hope that I did my best to assure her that we hear her, and we believe her, and we hear the cries of her people. Those are just a few examples of the stories and experiences that I got to share in times that just made me feel angry and hopeless, which is understandable, but it's very frustrating, especially just being there for a short time. We get to leave and go back to our lives, and the political unrest continues. But even with all of that, just the joy and resiliency of our Palestinian homestays, our Palestinian friends that we made was very clear. They just loved God, they loved one another, they loved community. Everything was so community oriented. And they truly, truly invited us into their homes, into their hearts, and that is something that I'll always be grateful for. That's just a little bit of my experience. If you want to talk more about it, I would be happy to. Just for now, I hope you join me in just this ongoing prayer for peace in the land, because it's very clear that they have this vision for the kingdom of God, and it is of justice and peace. And I just hope that we pray for that with them. Thank you.
Thanks, Marnie. Yeah, with our final song, I just wanted to echo what Marnie says and what Nate said and what Savannah said. It was a beautiful trip, and it was a hard trip because we've now made friends who are living trapped in Bet-Sahor under occupation and have lives that look so drastically different than we have or we could have imagined before this. And it can be easy to see all of that and see the Christians that we know and ask, where is God in that? And that's an ongoing question. But I think I'm comforted by the fact that he is among the least of these, and I'm also comforted by the promise that justice will roll like a river. So if you would sing about that with us.
See the day when justice rolls like a mighty river floods out of control. May that day be the day when together we say, let justice roll. Let justice roll. I wanna see the day love shakes the ground and the walls that separate come tumbling down. May that day be a day when together we say, let love shake the ground. Whoa, whoa. Love shake the ground. I wanna see the day when we stand tall and the heavy hands of oppression's finally gone. May that day be the day when together we say, let just come lead us on. Come lead us on. Come lead us on. May that day be the day when together we say,
Precious Lord, come lead us on.
Thanks, guys. Now we're gonna have some time for Q&A. So I'm gonna welcome 5 of the students who went on the trip up here to talk about their experience. Nate, if you want to join, I didn't ask you, but you're totally welcome to. Your prerogative. Sorry, I should have communicated that with you before we started. I'm gonna have to pull up a chair. How awkward of me. Sorry, guys. I'm a really good MC. I already prepared for it without even knowing. So, does anyone have any questions for this group about our trip, about the places we visited, the people we met, our experience, etc.? If not, I have some prepared. Don't worry, so it won't be awkward. I'll give this to Elena.
I'm curious if you guys could share a bit about your experience meeting with Musalaha and kind of their steps of reconciliation and, their work in the communities.
So we met with Musalaha at the very end on our last day of the trip, and earlier that day we visited the refugee camp. So I thought that it was just the perfect way to end things. This beautiful picture of reconciliation on both sides and kind of just striving for that.
What's Musalaha for the general public?
A reconciliation project. Is that a good way to say it? Ministry, yeah. It's led by Daniel and Wasim, and they are.
To my knowledge, they gather people from both sides, so like Israelis and Palestinians. Sorry, I'm blanking. And then they bring them to the desert because that's like common ground, or it's not anybody's place. Like nobody wants to own the desert, and so they bring them to the desert and they talk, and they have this like whole process of listening to each other, and they're in my notes. What else do they do?
So they have a 6-step. I'm joining the Q&A. They have a 6-step reconciliation process, and I'm not going to go over all the steps with you, but essentially they take Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian, and they bring them together to talk, and they start with focusing on their narratives, because if you can't tell, how Nate shared really wonderfully how the two narratives are somehow both true and disparate at the same time. And so they start talking about narrative and how they see the world, and talking about worldview, kind of like Core 150 moment. And then and then they go on and build friendship, and then at the end they send them out to do some sort of project. So I think the one that we had most recently heard about had done like an art gallery type thing, so the Israelis and the Palestinians do it together, and they try to bring something of reconciliation, unity, like out from that experience and send it out into the community. So we got to hear from some leaders of that, and it was truly glorious to be the last thing that we experienced there. Sorry, I'm not in the Q&A. Does anyone else have any questions? Karen.
So I understand that when you were out on your hiking in the hills, that you had to stop what you were doing and change course. Can you talk some more about that?
I was part of, so there's a small group of us that did not hike for various reasons. But the reason that we did not hike to the original path, so we were in Samaria, and then you could see the hill that the woman, the story of the woman at the well happened, and then like literally couple degrees to the right from where we were standing, was a city called Nablus, and I believe that a young Palestinian boy was killed. I want to say he was 8 or 16, which are 14.
14.
Somewhere in the middle. I knew that was very different ages. Either way, still tragic. And so people were marching on the streets and protesting. And it was really interesting because that day we actually talked to the mayor of Sebastia, who was doing his best and doing a really good job of providing leadership to the city to bring better infrastructure, but he had the news playing on in the background so we could see a little bit of the unrest as it was unfolding.
Thank you. Any other questions? Drew.
Thanks for all that you've shared. I had a question regarding some of these reconciliation efforts and movements. Clearly, you've gotten to hear a bit in some of the pieces, and part of what you're doing now tangibly is sharing with us. What are some ways going forward that you still intend to, A, be involved, and B, share with other people about how they can be involved in some of these ongoing reconciliation efforts, knowing that ultimately, of course, it is God who brings about reconciliation and invites us into that? What are ways that we can do things, and what are ways that you can do things?
This question came up a lot, like every person that we talked to on the trip about like, well, what do we do? That's kind of like the most basic question you could ever ask. And I think the most impactful one that I heard was at the end with Musalaha, where it was like, well, actually think about what you can do and then kind of go from there. And for me, at least right now where I'm at in life, it's continuing to talk about what we saw, like not forgetting about it. I know for me, even just seeing some of the things that we've talked about today and seeing some of the photos and hearing some of the stories, like I've already forgotten things about our trip. And so for me, it's gonna be about going back to the journals that we had to keep, looking at photos and remembering those like stories that we had. And also, I think my host family that we had, or I had in Palestine with one other guy, was a really good representation of what this can look like. They were actually Israeli citizens who were also Palestinian, so they could very easily kind of cross back and forth between Palestine and Israel. And just their perspective on the whole conflict was really interesting, and I noticed that they have a lot of struggles with identity of like who they actually are. The mom, she's probably in her 50s or 60s. She like wouldn't even say what she would identify as because she really doesn't know if she's Israeli or Palestinian. Two of the sons were Arab, Palestinian, and then I think also the daughters would say that as well. But they ultimately were saying like, we just need to love each other well and actually talk about what's happening. Because when we don't talk about it, nothing's going to happen. And if we just keep it in, then no progress is going to be made, and the world isn't going to see what's happening here. And they kind of, me and the other guy that I was with, were like, go and like share what's happening. Go tell people what you've seen and come back. Like, we want you to come back. Bring all your friends, bring your family. We'll host you. We'll make food for you. We'll take you around. And so it's about being uncomfortable with talking about conflict, and then sharing that with as many people. That's for me, at least.
I think that's very well said. I would also say, in terms of what can you do, as Americans, it's so easy to live in our little bubble and not pay attention to international news. So even checking the news and seeing weekly and seeing what's happening, that's one of the biggest things that I've tried to implement. Paying attention to what America does internationally. We have a huge part in it in terms of financial contributions to the Israeli government and voting. Even voting in your local elections, telling your representatives, doesn't seem like it could have a lot of impact, but if we all made a phone call and said that this is an issue that's important to us, we could actually make at least a little bit of change. And financial as well, which Cassidy will touch on here in a second, but we're college students right now, but when you actually start to make money, donating financially to different ongoing efforts for reconciliation and aid to Palestinian families.
Something that I was going to touch on was there's an Instagram account called Eye on Palestine, and that has been really helpful for me. Kind of like what Micah and Savannah was saying, but just like remembering what we experience, and then just every time I'm scrolling, I'll see an update of like, oh, this is what's going on in Palestine, another death or another like beating, or it's just something that just stirs something in me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, and it brings me to the Lord, and just being reminded of those stories and those people there that we met and love. And then the other thing I was going to mention was I went back to work like a couple days after our trip, and I had so many patients. I work at a clinic, physical therapy clinic, and I had a ton of patients and coworkers remember that I went, and they're like, oh, how was it? Was it just so glorious and magical and awesome? And I mean, parts of it were, but I saw the moment where I could have been like, oh yeah, it was great, and then just avoided all of the conflict and things that we talked about and learned. But I just every time I'm just like, no, I need to be honest. Like, it's a yes, and like, yes, it was great, but also there's so many people who are suffering and just experiencing injustice. And so I felt like, just what Micah said, be honest with sharing and just tell their stories was super important for me to continue to reconcile.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Another thing just to note is we met with Musalaha, as we were talking about, and they gave us 5 P's. I've forgotten what one of the P's are, but I know for sure these are 4 of the 5 P's that you can do for Palestine. Pray. Prayer has a lot more power than we give credit for. Political advocacy. Call your representative. That sounds silly because it seems like a drop in the bucket, but if every person who's in this room called their local representative and said, I want you to care more about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all of a sudden the Spokane local representative would be like, why do all these people care about this? And then maybe some things might start to move. Products, supporting Palestinian-made products, olive wood, those sorts of things, finding shops online that sell Palestinian products. I know my friends sell stickers. And then pilgrimage, visit, go see what it's like. And when you go with a group that goes into the West Bank. Don't just stay in Israel. There are a lot of church groups that won't even go into the West Bank at all because they refuse to acknowledge what is happening there, and they don't want you to acknowledge what is happening there. So visit Israel, visit Palestine, visit both. Talk to Israelis, talk to Palestinians. Pilgrimage. Forrest, do you have the 5th one right there? Programs like Musalaha or Sharuk is another one that we talked about. Eye on Palestine is an Instagram account. We gave you little papers when you came in. Those have some things on them that you can do and look at. Speaking of things you can do, thank you guys. I think we're going to transition to the last little part of our program here. Cass and I had just the most wonderful blessing to stay with the Nahars, who are just the most wonderful people in the world, and we love them. And Cass is going to invite us to action about that.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cassidy. Like everyone else who's spoken tonight, this trip really changed a deep part in my heart and soul, not just for like witnessing Jesus through the holy sites, but also through the people that we didn't expect to as much and hearing their stories. And for me personally, this mainly came through with my host family. From the first day that we got there, they just welcomed us into our home with, like Marnie was saying, food and conversation and tea, and the teenage girls that we stayed with shared their youth group drama, and we drove around listening to One Direction with the windows down, and they just shared so many connections with us that they didn't have to. This wasn't part of the job that they were being paid to do. It was connection that they wanted to have with us. And both that family and the community that they serve and the church that they're a part of, they exemplify Christ's love for us more than anyone I've ever met. And the community that they have there and the kind of worship that they're doing in their daily lives is just something that I think people should know about. And I just want to play this video really quick. It's of Besma, who's on the right side of the leftmost picture, yes. She would really love to come to Whitworth next year. And this could be a really cool opportunity kind of for that last question to think about what's something that we can do. And I've heard so many times since I got home that this is too big of a problem to solve, and it's one of the most like disheartening parts of coming back because it is huge. But I think there's no shame in starting with one person and watching it grow from there. So I'm gonna let Besma tell her story because she'll do a much better job than I will. But they have a really moving family story of what they've experienced in Palestine. So yeah, let's watch that.
Hello, my name is Besma and I'm a senior in high school. I'm a Palestinian Christian that lives in Bethlehem, the same exact location where Jesus was born. But I was originally born in Gaza. Today, I would like to share a little bit about myself. As a Palestinian girl, I was very fortunate to grow up in a home environment that encouraged faith in God, education, and success. And I'm so thankful for everything God has done in my life. But like every other story, life isn't always as easy. 15 years ago, my family and I were forced to move from Gaza to Bethlehem due to many reasons, but mainly due to safety and persecution of our faith. You see, not only were we facing conflict and war with Israeli occupation, but my father was also receiving threats for working in the Bible Society by the Islamic nationalist organization in Gaza. And after ignoring many of their threats, they decided to kidnap my father's co-worker and family friend and murder him for being a Christian. As a minority, Christians were terrified, and many of them left shortly after receiving their permits from Israeli forces. And thankfully, after a long and terrifying wait, my family was also granted this permit. Crossing the border from Gaza to Bethlehem was not an easy task, because we were also met by Israeli forces on the way. I don't remember the exact details, but I was told that my 7-month pregnant mother at the time was carrying my older sister while my father held my hand and carried the only 2 bags we had from home with us. We were faced by this huge tank that held us captive, hands up under the rain in an open field until they checked our permits and let us go. But as soon as we crossed this point, we knew that there was no coming back, even if it meant that we were going to leave our whole lives, our family and friends and everything we've ever known before behind. And thankfully, God has been with us through every step of the way. Today, my father is involved in many ministries, including bringing Palestinian youth to Christ, and my mom is a Sunday school teacher at our church. I'm also glad to say that my siblings and I are a part of this ministry. We have gone through experiences that varied from aiding refugees in camps to organizing children's programs with our church. And these experiences not only helped us view life through other people's perspectives, but also brought us closer to God. While conflict is still on and freedom is very limited in my country, I believe that there will be better days. Which brings me to say, I truly believe studying abroad in the US in a healthy Christian environment, it can offer me a rewarding college education and introduce me to opportunities that may help execute my cause. By then, I sure would have acquired the right confidence and skills to ensure my success, as well as my ambition to contribute back to my people with the knowledge that I've gained in the time there. Unfortunately, I know that achieving this is not easy, and life here is very challenging in many ways, for including our low economic state, since everything is controlled by the occupation and little is given to us. And therefore, affording such education is extremely difficult, but I am willing to try my best to achieve this dream. And I don't know how or what doors God will open in the future, but I hope that this journey, if it's in action, doesn't only help me grow as an individual, but also help develop growth in my country and ministry as well. Thank you.
I hope the call to prayer in the background wasn't too distracting. As Besma kind of talked about, like her family itself has such a huge impact in their community. Christian Palestinians make up less than 1% of the population there. So the stuff that they're doing and the risks that they're taking to expand God's kingdom and show people who Jesus is crazy. I remember a conversation that Aaron and I got to have with them about their involvement with Samaritan's Purse, the Christmas child boxes, and it was really crazy for me to see like pictures and videos of them serving communities that like need more help than they do, when we're there like figuring out how we can help them, and they're still here serving other people and acting selflessly in their faith. And I just think that they're great examples for us, and for me personally is something that I feel like I can pursue to help this. But some other ways are, I feel like, just understanding and knowing how to steward our freedoms as Americans. A lot of us have never experienced oppression or occupation, and I think that that's a gift and a blessing and something to honor God with and honor others with. And so finding ways to steward that well through like programs and organizations that might support people who are experiencing that, or just knowing that and serving the people around you in your community. And kind of regardless of your political stance on anything that was said tonight, I know it's kind of a hot topic, so there can be some varying opinions, but I think that we can find fellowship and community in the aching of our hearts for people like the Palestinians who are experiencing this kind of oppression, and find a way to be with our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world who are experiencing pain. And if you feel called to support Besma's scholarship, I have this QR code to a GoFundMe for her, but I understand we're not all in that position, especially as college kids, so your prayers and word of mouth and sharing on social media or whatever you can do is also just as helpful. And it doesn't have to be Besma, but anywhere that you can think about this more and spread the word and do something to make a little bit of a difference would be awesome. And one last note, there's some posters in the back that my graphic design friend Abigail made that are beautiful, and they're for sale if you want to support Besma's scholarship. Every dollar of it's going to go to her being able to come to Whitworth next year. So thank you.
Thanks, Cass. Very important last slide. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming out. I hope today was illuminating and interesting and challenging. I will just give you a little benediction to send you out. May you go now from this place with care in your hearts for the least of these, knowing that the God of justice goes with you. The Lord be with you. You're free. Yalla bye. Oh, also